So we've already sort of started jumping into this by talking about through the code of ethics, the contracts, and things like that. But there's a whole series of different ways that this exam becomes about legal questions. Um, and one of the big aspects of the kind of legal thinking, you could already hear in the way that Heather and I were talking about that last example, is the sort of idea of risk and how risk sort of exists out in the world, especially in the architectural and construction world, and that you're never going to get rid of risk, right? I mean, everything you do is risky, and that's good, right? That's how things get done. That's how interesting buildings get made. It's good to be at least a bit risky, but understanding risk and the kind of legal ramifications that sort of flow around it are really important. Uh, Heather, you want to maybe give an example or something?
I'm not necessarily thinking of all the different risk points when you mention this, but I am thinking that to kind of begin to understand these points of risk, similar to what you have already said, is you need to know what you know and know what you don't know, and ask the relevant questions to the experts that you have on your team.
Yeah,
And
and so again, just to be beat the dead horse here, it's a lot about communication.
I like how you went full circle there.
Um, maybe like, do you have an example of that? Know what you know and know what you don't know.
I'm thinking specifically with this tiny little building that we're doing right now. Um, the original person who took on this job, so I'm the second person to have worked on this job. The original person to work on the job, knows all about the culture of the area, the scope, the architecture of the area, but knew enough to know that he did not know all of the code requirements, all the accessibility requirements, and that sort of thing. And before that really blew up in his face, he knew to ask out for help.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so before signing off on anything, or
I think that's a really good sort of general comment. I mean, this is one of those things. Young architects, and I say this like I was the worst about this when I was a young man. Young architects don't like implying that they don't know everything. It's just one of those things. People who become architects tend to be people who want to feel like they know everything, and nobody knows everything. Like there's all sorts of situations that you have to be willing to sort of find out from other people, and to be open to that communication, and to be looking to find the right people who can help in situations. And then there's other times when it's important for the architect to be able to kind of make a decision on their own, and move forward. Uh, but essentially, at no point in architecture and at no point in the exam will the exam be expecting that you would know everything, right? The whole point of the new exam is that you can find it out. And the ways you find it out is by reviewing the code, reviewing the program, reviewing the client needs, reviewing the context, by going to the site, understanding the site better by spending time there. So you're always sort of searching for more information, because the assumption is that you don't have it all. And nobody would expect you to have it all. That's not the point. The point is, how do you organize what you do know, and how do you organize so the points that you don't know have a place to slide into your design and into your communication systems of the drawing sets, et cetera. Um, so like I think a kind of an example of this sort of thing is, like, you imagine you're on a job site, and you're walking around the job site, and somebody is digging a big trench, and there's a bunch of people all walking around next to this big earth moving device that's digging a great big trench. Uh, like, it feels a little dangerous. It doesn't feel quite right. What should you do? Well, the sort of obvious thing you should do is tell them, well, don't let people walk near the big trench and let the trench get finished. So say, hey, put a fence here, or stop doing that while people are around, or something along those lines. But that's actually not your role. And so what you're talking about in that situation is assuming the liability of the GC. So the GC's role is to make sure that safety on the job site is there, and the GC's role is to figure out when the trench gets dug and how that's all going to work. So you really shouldn't be saying anything about that on that job site. But of course, that's also a little ridiculous, right? That if you can't say anything, then somebody could get hurt. So because you're a person, because you're trying to do the right thing out in the world, like there's going to be moments where you're going to say something that is a little different than what is sort of the direct legal understanding. And this is that kind of understanding moment where you're trying to place in the context of the ethical discussions, the contractual discussions, all of what it means to be an architect, what the point of what your role is on a job site, and then making sure that you sort of understand the gist of how all those things relate, so that when you do say something to the GC, you're not undermining your firm and taking on legal responsibility that you didn't mean to take, right? So that's really kind of the legal side of things. It's not about knowing all the exact detail. Again, it's sort of just making sure that you understand the context of the contracts, that you understand the context of the sort of ethical relationships of you to the public, that you understand the kind of how the team works and where the levels of expertise are. And even in that context, the GC is part of that team, right? They have certain levels of expertise. You may not know about all their levels of expertise. So having systems and sort of understanding how all those things kind of fit together in a sort of general way, that's a big part of this exam. Very little of it is going to be super specific. A lot of it will be, here's a scenario, what makes the most sense out of these possible answers.
And a lot of times, not to beat the dead horse, it comes back, the question on the exam will lead back to some sort of communication.
Yeah.
I mean, like you're saying here, you see someone who's working on an elevator chase and he's not tethered off or something. Do you just turn around and walk away knowing that that's not reasonable? Or do you communicate concern somewhere without dictating it?
Exactly. Communicate without dictating it. That's a great way to say that. I'm going to steal that one and use that in my later lectures. Exactly. So I think that's a good one to sort of wrap this up on, that sense of, none of these are about detail. They're all about sort of trying to understand the context about how these things sort of relate to each other, and then being able to see that context in the questions so that you can answer. And it's almost always going to be reasonable, use good communication, get the expertise that you need, make sure you're following all the governing bodies that are appropriate for you to follow. Like none of it is going to be how do you sneak through without getting insurance or anything like that, right? It's all going to be about just doing it sort of reasonably, and that's what the practice management exam is going to be about.